The next question is, in what order the New Testament Gospels were written? The early church fathers said that Matthew wrote his Gospel first in the Hebrew language, then Mark wrote his Gospel based on taking notes from Peter's preaching in Rome, then Luke wrote his Gospel based on interviewing eyewitnesses and reading others' written accounts, then John wrote his later with an intention of giving more information that was the others were missing from Jesus' early years of ministry. But over the last 200 years, many scholars have concluded that Mark was written first for several reasons. First, because it's shorter. Second, because of a perceived more primitive or colloquial literary style. Third, because of so-called harder readings. And fourth, because there's a lot of shared material which seem to match either Matthew or Luke alternatingly, both in the order of the stories and also the similar or exact wording. The question of how to explain the similarities and yet differences between the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, is called the Synoptic Problem or Synoptic Puzzle. Now, scholars talk about the triple tradition material, which is narrative shared between all three of the Synoptic Gospels, versus double tradition material, which is not found in Mark, but it's found in both Matthew and Luke. Here's a nice diagram from Wikipedia showing this. And this raises some questions. How did this sharing happen? And if borrowing occurred, which direction did it go? For example, about 94% of Mark also appears in Matthew, with similar wording, but usually not identical. And about 80% of Mark also appears in Luke. Matthew and Luke also have their own sources for different material, and about a quarter of that material is shared as the so-called double tradition material. For example, here is the story from the triple tradition of the story of Jesus healing a leper. All three Gospels record that he said to Jesus, "If you wish, I can be cleansed." And Jesus replied, "I wish it, be cleansed," and touched him, and he was immediately healed. The words in bold here are identical in the Greek, and as you can see, there are also some differences. The most commonly held theory among modern scholars is called the two-source theory, and that is that Matthew and Luke both borrowed from Mark and from another hypothetical document called Q, for which there is no direct manuscript evidence. Supposedly, Q was a gospel that contained only sayings and teachings of Jesus, not descriptions of his activities, his itinerary, his death, and resurrection. There have been no manuscripts ever found of this Q document, and none of the early church fathers ever mentioned it, although they talked about the writing of the other Gospels. There are many other theories for how this sharing could have taken place. Some scholars think that the best explanation is not copying of written documents, but simply shared oral tradition behind all three Gospels, or at least behind Matthew and Mark, and then Luke used Matthew and Mark as written sources. Another theory is that Matthew used Mark and Q, and Luke used all three. Now, interesting, I'm just showing these three, and there's many other theories that you can read about at the supplemental material. Now, Luke himself says at the beginning of his gospel that, quote-unquote, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Many have basically written down accounts about Jesus based on the words of eyewitnesses, and that he had carefully investigated everything from the beginning, or it could be translated from the source. And he, too, decided to write an orderly account. So it sounds like he could very well have been using previously written sources, as well as interviewing eyewitnesses himself. And by the time he wrote his account, there were already many other accounts circulating. So there's nothing strange about this. Luke himself says that this is the account, this is the way that things were. Now, why do many scholars think that Luke used Q instead of just using Matthew and Mark? Well, one reason is that in the triple tradition, Luke shows some differences to Matthew. And supposedly that would not happen if Luke was just using Matthew. Of course, if Luke had additional eyewitnesses that he was interviewing, he could have had independent reason to diverge from Matthew's wording, or it could be that Matthew revised his gospel later after Luke made a copy of an earlier version. Let's look at some evidence now against Q, or against the theory of the Q document. There are many places where Luke and Matthew have the same wording that are in the travel itinerary sections or miracle sections, not just in the sections about Jesus' sayings and teachings. For example, both Matthew and Luke mention that Jesus visited Nazareth before Capernaum, where Mark just mentions Capernaum. Also, the spelling of Nazareth in the Greek here is an unusual spelling. And you can read more about this in the supplemental links. But both Matthew and Luke have the same unusual spelling. So if Luke was borrowing from Q, that Q would be including Jesus' travel itinerary as well as Jesus' sayings. And basically it means that Q is looking more and more like Matthew. So again, probably no need for a separate extra Q document. Another example is in the narrative of Jesus' trial and crucifixion, called the Passion Narrative, where both Matthew and Luke record this extra phrase that the guards mocked Jesus with. Who is the one who smote you? But scholars don't think that the hypothetical Q document contained a Passion narrative, so again it looks more likely that Luke was simply copying from Matthew here, or from the same oral tradition that Matthew used. There are more than 1,000 of these so-called minor agreements between Matthew and Luke that are not found in Mark, and you can read more details in the supplement links. There is also a copy of Matthew in Hebrew from the 14th century, in a work called Even Bohan by Shem Tov. Scholars have noticed that this copy has been modified quite a bit to try to show that Jesus was not the Messiah. So it's definitely not an original wording. But it has section breaks in 16 places, such as in the Sermon on the Mount, which happen to exactly match the places where Luke's Gospel diverged from Matthew. So it seems that it could be a copy of a much earlier Hebrew work. And also, Epiphanius and Jerome and others in the 4th and 5th century referenced a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew that was read in the 1st century by the Nazarene sect, and apparently there was a copy in the library of Caesarea where Eusebius was. So there could be a Hebrew earlier Gospel of Matthew that was written in either Aramaic or Hebrew. Scholars are still debating these topics, and there are many different views. So let me share. These are the two views that I think are most likely. I couldn't narrow it down to one, so I just thought I'd share both of the two that I think are the best solution to the synoptic authorship puzzle. I currently see either this modified independence oral sources view or the modified three source view with the Hebrew or Aramaic Matthew as the best approach. I'm currently leaning toward either the independence theory that says that Matthew and Mark were independently written based on oral testimony passed down from Jesus' disciples, with a slight tweak that says Luke probably had both Matthew and Mark available, as well as other documents and eyewitnesses he could interview, or a modified three-source theory, which I'll explain in a moment. Let's look at some diagrams explaining these views. The independence view is the view that both Matthew and Mark were basing their gospel on a common oral tradition, instead of one borrowing from a written copy of the other. Now, I think Luke could very likely have been using written copies of Matthew and Mark, since he specifically mentions other collections and writing another written account. As the apostles started teaching Jerusalem immediately after Jesus' resurrection, they would have collaborated together to establish a collection of shared teaching material. The original collection would have been quite early, since Acts 2:42, 5:42, and 6:2-4 indicate that the apostles were teaching in Jerusalem every day as what they called the ministry of the word. The collection potentially started within weeks of Jesus' death, because they were starting to teach at that time, and then it was added to over the next month and years as the 12 apostles and other disciples discussed together to remember Jesus' life and teachings. Some of Jesus' teachings might even have been written down before his death, since shorthand or tachygraphy was a skill used by scribes prior to and during the time of Jesus to take fast notes during speeches. But probably the main way his teachings were preserved were from his disciples, preaching their memorized versions of Jesus' teachings every week and telling the stories of Jesus' life based on their memory. And so this model would look like this. Now the big unknown question is, when did they write down on parchment the teachings that they were sharing every week? It could have been as early as a couple weeks after Jesus' resurrection, or it could be as late as 10 years later, 20 years later, or even 30 years later for the Synoptic Gospels. And there's some arguments for both earlier or later dates of writing this tradition down. The public weekly oral teachings could have existed side by side with privately written notes on parchments or paper or papyrus for many years, probably papyrus, until it was eventually distributed in written form. Regardless of when this transition from oral to written happened, it makes sense that Matthew would have been the one among the 12 apostles chosen to write these teachings down. He's probably the most educated of the original 12 disciples. As he was a tax collector, he would have been able to converse and read and write in the local language, Aramaic, and perhaps Hebrew, and also write in Greek and probably some Latin too, as a tax collector. Now, Matthew may have written this Hebrew or Aramaic and Greek version at the same time, or he might have written the Greek version later as a translation. And then later, John wrote his gospel, and by that time, he probably had access to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now for the other model. We know that all the earliest church fathers said that Matthew wrote first in the Hebrew language, which might refer to either Hebrew or possibly Aramaic. And also, there is this concept from comparing the synoptic gospels that Matthew and Luke may have had Mark's gospel available to read, and some other earlier common source in addition to Mark's gospel nicknamed Q. So if this earlier source was in fact an earlier document written by the Apostle Matthew, that would solve both of these questions at the same time. It also answers the question of why none of the early church fathers bothered to make copies of this valuable Q source, because, namely, they were instead making copies of the updated and expanded Greek version of Matthew written by Matthew. So they would not have bothered to share this earlier Q document, supposed, this hypothetical Q document. And this model says, well, meanwhile, of course, Mark wrote his gospel based on Peter's preaching in Rome. They may have had a copy of Matthew's early written document with them, or Peter may have simply used his memorized version of the shared oral teachings that he and Matthew and the other disciples had collected together. And then later, Luke used both Matthew and Mark, along with probably other documents and eyewitness interviews, to write his gospel. Mark and Matthew may then have revised their gospels over time to the form we now have them in today, and these revisions may explain some of the differences that are now debated as part of the so-called synoptic problem, the slight wording differences and so on. These could have been based on what the authors selectively chose to include, based on the audiences they were writing to, and also differences based on the recollection of different eyewitnesses, and based on actually how Jesus might have said things differently when he preached the same topics in various places. That's a commonly overlooked source of these differences between the Gospels. If Jesus preached the same sermon 20 times and said different words in those sermons, and Matthew might have written down one way, Luke might have written it down a different way, based on their sources or their memories, in the case of Matthew. And, of course, John then had access to all these things when he was writing later. I think that either of these solutions to the synoptic puzzle, either the oral sources theory or the early modified three-source theory, could explain the data decently well, but I'm holding loosely onto these models because scholars are still debating this and the data is not clear exactly which model best explains the relationship. Now we can put together an approximate dating of the documents. None of the Gospels mention the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and that would have been very convenient for them to mention, especially in books like other New Testament books like Hebrews and Galatians and Acts. But basically, we can see that most of the New Testament was written before 70, although some, like John's Gospel and Epistles and Revelation, may have been written later. Some scholars date the Gospels much later, such as between 70 and 90 AD, the Synoptic Gospels. These scholars say that Jesus is portrayed as predicting the destruction of Jerusalem in Matthew 24:15, Mark 13:14, Luke 21:20, and telling his disciples when to flee out of the city, for example, when it's about to be captured. And these scholars do not believe that such predictions could really be prophecy about the future. So, based on that assumption, the scholars say that these books must have been written after AD 70. But, if you look more closely at this, the passages seem to be a mix of both near-term and much longer-term prophecy. Jesus definitely does predict the fall of Jerusalem, such as in Luke 19:41-44, etc. But the parts that tell his followers to flee the city do not match the historical pattern of the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus tells his disciples to flee when they see a desecration of the temple, and in Luke, Jesus tells his disciples to flee when they see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. But both of those warnings would have been too late to be of any practical use in AD 70 situation. So it's much more likely that they were written before AD 70, based on what Jesus actually said and predicted, even though the authors didn't fully understand what it referred to. Also, Luke mentioned the fulfillment of the prophecy of a worldwide famine in Acts 11:28. So if Luke and Acts had been written after Jerusalem's destruction, that most likely would have been mentioned somewhere as a fulfillment of prophecy.